Hi out there. Welcome back to our Land Bulletin series. I'm Haley Mirr, and I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Development here at Mirr Ranch Group. For those of you who are first joining, this is the Land Bulletin, where every other week we discuss the ranch and sporting property market, buying and selling advice, the latest best stewardship practices, as well as topics currently impacting landowners. Mirr Ranch Group is a full-service ranch real estate brokerage and consulting company focusing on legacy ranches and sporting and conservation properties around the West. An important part of stewardship of the West is maintaining the natural wildlife populations and their habitat. A key piece of managing these populations is through hunting and fishing practices, which is regulated and controlled by state game and fishing departments. To help us discuss the importance of these departments is the Senior VP of Mirr Ranch Group, land manager, and top tier, must I say, hunting guide, Jared Souza. Welcome, Jared.
Good morning, everyone. How are you?
How are we doing?
I'm good. Just enjoying the spring weather up here in Wyoming, praying for a little bit more moisture before it really turns warm.
Well, thanks for joining today, Jared, to help me out with this conversation. And I'll let you kind of introduce our guests, but we're really excited to have our next guest on the Land Bulletin today.
Yeah, awesome. So we invited Brian Nesvik, and he's the director of the Wyoming Game and Fish, a landowner up here in Wyoming, and he has a lot of stuff to talk about with all game and fish related today.
Amazing. Well, without further ado, let's welcome Brian Nesvik onto the show.
Hey, well, good morning, Haley and Jared. It's a pleasure to be with you here this morning.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. I know you're a busy man and you got a lot of podcasts and interviews and things today we just talked about. So thanks for taking the time to join Mirr Ranch Group this morning.
Yeah, like I said, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you folks about things that are really important to Wyoming.
Awesome. Well, before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of what we are chatting about today, I'd love to know what your relationship is with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and the state, and kind of your background and where you got here today.
Yeah, so I've been fortunate enough to be with the department for going on 29 years now this year, and started out as a game warden out in the field and worked around southeast and central Wyoming, and had the opportunity to then work in western Wyoming and Pinedale, then up to Cody, and then here for this last 13 years or so, I've been down in Cheyenne working at the administrative level. I served as the chief game warden and the chief of the wildlife division for 8 years, and then when Governor Gordon was elected, he appointed me as the director in 2019.
Amazing. And so those of us who are listening probably do understand who the Wyoming Game and Fish Department are, but for those who don't, what are the duties of your department and what do you do for the state of Wyoming?
Yeah, so we have a statutory charge that's in Wyoming law that directs the department to manage all wildlife in the state, and I stress the word all wildlife, all 800 species of fish and terrestrial wildlife across the state of Wyoming, and to manage those wildlife resources in trust for the citizens of the state. In Wyoming law, the statutes dictate that the state of Wyoming owns wildlife in the state, and so we're given the charge to develop a system of management for all those critters and the lands that they live on, and that's our primary charge. We also have a lot of other responsibilities that come with that. Obviously, we have to protect those wildlife, so enforce game and fish laws. We have a responsibility for watercraft safety and managing recreational use of waters across the state, and certainly have responsibilities that go beyond that. But those are our primary charges in the statutes.
Okay, got it. And when was the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, when was it created? When was there a need, and when did the state see a need to have a department like this to kind of oversee everything?
Yeah, so actually it started when it was a territory. They developed their first laws that dealt with protection of wildlife. There was only a couple of them on the books. In 1898, the legislature developed the office of the state game warden, which is equivalent to the position I hold today. It was the one person in the state that was charged with managing game and fish and protecting them. In 1921, the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission was formed by the legislature and the governor at the time, and that was probably the biggest step that really established a system and a process for wildlife to be managed in the state. All the employees that are now department employees at that time were employees of the commission. That point in time is just on the heels of when there was a lot of market hunting in not only Wyoming but across the West that had decimated a lot of big game herds, and a lot of actually waterfowl and even turkeys had decimated populations of wildlife across the West. And decision makers at that time saw a need to enact laws, to adopt some kind of a model to manage wildlife. And so that was the beginning of the commission. That movement happened in the 20s and the 30s, 1920s, 1930s. And that worked for quite some time. But in 1973, there was a major recodification of Wyoming statutes. And at that time, they created the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. They restructured the commission to the current form that it is today, and updated a lot of the laws that were on the book of life at that time. And things have been pretty much the same since 1973. But that's actually when the department was formed, and a lot of folks don't know that. They figure the department's just been around for as long as people have been wearing red shirts, but that's not the case.
I was going to say, I would have imagined it had been around kind of since the beginning of kind of Wyoming and the legislation that existed. So it's interesting to know that not till 1970s was this kind of what it is today.
Yeah, it's a really neat history.
And how do you, Brian and Jared, how do you guys know each other? Is this the first time you're meeting, or do you guys have a history with one another?
No, I had the opportunity to meet Jared actually outside of Game and Fish through my family ranch. My wife's family ranch has been engaged in some discussions on conservation easements, and Jared sits on the Wyoming Stockbrokers Land Trust Board of Directors, and I had the opportunity to meet Jared through that nexus. And then also, I am a member of the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. In fact, I serve now as the president of that association. And we've done some work with Jared and your company as well regarding holdings that entity has, that the Western Association has.
Awesome.
Yeah, so it's been going on for a while. I actually met Brian previous to that. We had interviewed him. I think it was for a Wyoming Hunger Initiative deal. We filmed on, I think, Barry's Ranch. Right before that, I think it was right after you were brought on by Governor Gordon, and they got that stuff going. So I think we've known each other for a little while yet, and crossed paths in a bunch of different ways. So I did have one thing I was wanted to go back to, Brian. You had mentioned, you brought up the point about all Wyoming's wildlife. Obviously from the outside looking in, a lot of folks always, talk about big game and small game, all the game animals, but there's obviously some large challenges going on in the state for non-game animals. Can you kind of tee off on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. There are far more species in Wyoming that are native, that have been here long before we ever were, that are not hunted or not fished for. And those species are really important in our state. Wyoming's been a leader for a very long time in protecting, conserving non-game species. So one of probably the species that we're most known for is the black-footed ferret. And back in the early 80s, the last, in fact, most folks thought black-footed ferrets were extinct. And there was a discovery of a ferret in Meeteetse, And that really kicked into gear a cooperative effort between the state and many others to basically raise captive black-footed ferrets so that they could be reintroduced into their native habitats. We have a lot of other species as well that are important to ecosystems, that are important to our state, and a lot of those species we don't have a lot of information on because we haven't invested the resources over time to look at those other species. And so now that's something that we've increased our efforts with, some by force, some because we were interested. But a lot of those species, when you don't have a lot of information on them, they become vulnerable to being listed under the Endangered Species Act. We certainly believe that all wildlife in our state is best managed by the state and not by the federal government. And so a lot of our non-game work now is to look at species that may have some challenges and figure out what we need to do for them to conserve them and make sure that they don't end up on the endangered species list.
And when you collect that data, just from, a layman's terms, because I'm a city gal, are you working with ranchers to get some of that data of where, those species exist? Kind of who are you working with to get a lot of that data compiled?
Yeah, a lot of it is on private land.
Mm-hmm.
When the first white folks came west, a couple hundred years ago and started settling the West, a lot of those places that were first settled were the most productive habitats. And those are the private lands that we have today. We obviously have great public lands as well, but some of the most productive habitats in the state are on private land. And so a lot of our work with non-game is working cooperatively, voluntary, with private landowners. The black-footed ferret work has been an incredible partnership with landowners. Many landowners have come to us and said, look, we know ferrets used to live here on our property back before we were here. How can we have black-footed ferrets again? And a lot of our reintroductions, in fact, almost all of them have been on private land with willing landowners that wanted to participate.
That's awesome.
We also spend, significant time. Sorry about that. We also spend a lot of time with our federal land management agencies as well. But a lot of work is with private landowners, for sure.
And what are some of the tools, the educational tools, things like that, available to landowners that you all provide when kind of handling some of these different habitat management techniques?
Yeah, so we've got, a lot of research and actions and projects and some science from our own university as well as others that we work cooperatively with the University of Wyoming to provide landowners the information they need to make good decisions on their ranches when it comes to wildlife. And there's a variety of different things. We've got all the way from research papers to just, brochures that highlight the most important actions and techniques that we can take. We again work with the University of Wyoming. A lot of times the extension services at the university have got really good land management practice advice that really coincides with good wildlife management practices and protecting habitats for both ranching and for wildlife. And so there's a plethora of information out there for landowners, and it works best on a species by species, case by case basis with the individual landowner. But there's a lot out there, and there's been a lot of work done on this. So
awesome. So in addition to landowner education and figuring out how we can better protect these species, what might have existed on their land, those kinds of things, what other pieces of education are you guys doing for, not just landowners, but citizens of Wyoming, of what their role is and how they can help maintain these habitats in the state of Wyoming?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Haley. That's something that I'm very passionate about, and I've made a really high priority for our department. I feel strongly that most of us that have an interest in wildlife in our state, we got hooked usually at an early age. There was some experience or some opportunity we had that really got us hooked on the outdoors and caring about wildlife resources in our state and all the places that they live. And so I've really encouraged not only within my agency, but just folks across our state to take the time to provide those opportunities to our youth to make sure that 30 years from now, we have people in our state that care enough to do all the things that need to be done to manage wildlife and to care for them, not just within the agency, but across the state, just citizens of our state. We've got a few really important recent developments. We've really expanded our Trout in the Classroom initiative, which is an opportunity for kids to learn all about how trout life cycles work. We provide them all the tools in an aquarium and the eggs, and they get to watch the eggs hatch and develop into little fingerling fish over time. And that's a really very popular program in the schools. We've also brought the National Archery in the Schools program into our schools in Wyoming and helped facilitate that to provide archery shooting opportunity. And then we've also, hunter education is a legal requirement if you're going to hunt in Wyoming, but it's also a really good tool. There's a lot in hunter education that talks about wildlife management, wildlife identification, habitat, and all the importance of that. And now we have enabled these schools to, in a bigger way than they used to, be able to provide hunter education in our public schools, which I think is really important. And in addition to that, we now have on the books opportunities for teachers to actually be certified to teach hunter education through the Teachers Training and Standards Board. All very cool opportunities, and we feel strongly that that's a really good way to get, if you live in Wyoming and you have these kind of natural resources, it's pretty important for that to be a kind of base level education, and we feel strongly about that, and the schools have been pretty darn receptive to that.
I'm sure. I 100%. I agree with you that baseline, especially in Wyoming, where those natural resources are right outside your back door. I mean, Colorado, I feel like we would have benefited from some of the similar education. But that's neat that you're starting them young and keeping them kind of the understanding that some of this management does kind of come from these recreational hobbies as well, not just conservation or all these other things. There's kind of an education of kind of habitats through that means too. I know, Jared, you've probably throughout your life, it started baseline for you at some point. Was it through these guys or your dad?
Yeah, you know what? I think I took my hunter ed class when I was 9 years old in Medicine Bow, Wyoming, and Scott Browning, I think still on the department, taught that class. So that was kind of my introduction. And the crazy thing is I think the first game animal I ever harvested was a sage grouse. And at that time in Medicine Bow and Shirley Basin area, there was just thousands of them everywhere. It wasn't real hard to go kill your limit. And the unfortunate part is it doesn't seem like there's near as much sage grouse up in that area as there was when I was a kid. But that was where I kind of cut my teeth. It was up in the Shirley Basin area with Scott Browning. And to go back to the endangered species stuff and the black-footed ferrets. So the ranch that I grew up on and my dad was managing outside of Shirley Basin is where they did a lot of that black-footed ferret reintroduction. So I had a lot of exposure to the federal guys and then the Wyoming Game and Fish when as a young guy when they were tracking them ferrets around. In fact, I think my first paying job was trapping live prairie dogs on behalf of the Wyoming Game and Fish, and I think we were selling them, and I think they were probably coming down to the Seville Center, right, Brian? Because we had to keep them alive, and then a Game and Fish guy would pick them up, and we were getting paid. I can't remember. It was 25 cents or 50 cents a live prairie dog, and so I did that all summer long with my dad. That was my first job.
That's pretty cool. That captive breeding program that we had in Seville was, really that was the hinge pin to be able to get us to where we are now, where we've got ferrets in multiple states and certainly across Wyoming. A lot of the places in Shirley Basin and south of there, between there and Arlington, have taken black-footed ferrets, and you were a part of that. You were feeding them with your catching prairie dogs.
Yeah.
That's great. I mean, that just shows how important that kind of education is. I mean, Jared now is sitting on the board of Wyoming Stock Growers Ag Land Trust, and some of that hunting education and habitat education is kind of what led you to where you are today. So it's neat to know that a lot of other Wyoming youth and kids are kind of getting a lot of that info from you guys, Brian.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, when I wasn't far from Jared when I was a young lad, and I grew up in Casper till I was 14, and same experience. The first game animal I harvested was a sage grouse, and actually I was in a place not far from Shirley Base in the north end. I was in Deer Creek Park, and when I had my dad and an older friend of his took me deer hunting, and that was my first experience interacting with a game warden. And after that half an hour discussion, I was 14 years old, and I decided I was going to become a Wyoming game warden. It was a life-changing experience to have that interaction, and that's really instilled in me the importance of how our folks that wear red shirts and drive green trucks, how important it is that they interact with our public. The public wants that, and it's important.
So in addition to kind of the education that you guys are providing, what are some of the other ways you're encouraging the population of Wyoming to become outdoors people, whether it be programs with women, programs with guys, kids? How are you recruiting a lot of kind of these hunters through mentor programs?
Yeah, so we do have a really good summer camp program where we in Whiskey Basin, we have a really neat conservation camp is what we call it, just outside of DuBois. And we're able to host several kids there each year and give them a lot of different opportunities. Obviously, it's that time of year, it's not all hunting and fishing. There's a lot of other outdoor activities that we provide for the kids. We also have Becoming an Outdoor Woman as a curriculum within Game and Fish. We do a couple of those every year where women from across the state can go and learn outdoor skills that they may not have been able to learn to that point in their lives. Very popular program. Typically, we don't have enough spots for everybody that wants to do it. We have a magazine that I'm extremely proud of. It's an award-winning magazine, has been for years. It's one of the last print, magazines of its kind, and it really has excellent photography and provides some really good, just conservation, outdoor education, background kind of information. We have a magazine that's specific for kids. It's a smaller publication, and so yeah, now we're exploring ways through social media, through our website, through our extensive email list, to do other outreach that a lot of it I don't even understand. I got a lot of gray hair in my beard now, and so a lot of that stuff I don't completely understand. But I hire people that do understand it and do it really well, and we've made some major moves and had some real effect with using some of that newer technology to get the word out to folks.
That's awesome. And I'd love to know too, in addition to kind of like the education and those kinds of programs, what are some big initiatives that Wyoming Fish and Game are working on right now with regards to, different types of species, migratory corridors? What are some of the kind of bigger projects that you guys are working on?
Yeah, so Wyoming is considered a leader in the country with regards to wildlife crossings. There's no good that comes from a dead deer, elk, or antelope laying on the side of the road. And there's a public safety risk there. And there's also certainly impacts to game animals. And we've built roads all over the state, and a lot of them are become pretty darn impermeable to those critters that need to cross there to get from one important habitat to another. And so we have really done some great work with investing a lot of money securing a lot of federal grants to do highway crossings around the state. We just finished one at 8 or 9 underpasses south of Big Piney, in the middle of Mule Deer Winter Range. We just secured the funding to do a similar project south of Kemmerer, where the new nuclear plant's going to go in. We did a big project up in between Casey and Buffalo on I-25 there. We're working now on one east of DuBois. And so that wildlife crossing initiative has been something that over this last 5 years, we've made a huge priority. The governor's made it a priority, and it's paying off. We've done some great work. And kind of alongside that, but it's still a separate issue, is work on migration corridors. There's a lot of important science that has to be developed before you can actually identify where those corridors are. But we've been able to initiate a lot of that science, and the governor put in place an executive order that provided some clear direction on how the state would protect those migration corridors. The focus and the executive order applies to public land. However, it provides some good advice to private landowners who voluntarily want to implement practices that reduce surface disturbance in those most important parts of those corridors. So, as you mentioned, migration corridor work is really important to the state. We've got a lot of other work right now with mule deer. Mule deer are a huge concern for all of our citizens, not just folks that hunt or fish, but we've seen mule deer declines in our state over the last, since Jared and I were kids. We've seen some pretty big declines, and it's not just Wyoming, it's across the West. And so we've got a mule deer initiative that's been in place for a long time that we invest a lot of money in every year to do habitat work on both private and public land for mule deer. We've spent quite a bit of time on some of the things that aren't as sexy, but really important, like with wildlife disease and feed ground management in the West. We just approved last week, the commission approved a new feed ground management plan. Our state has fed elk on both public and private lands for the last 120 years. And now we have two competing diseases, CWD for wildlife, that's 100% fatal, and brucellosis that is carried by wildlife, but it's transmitted to livestock. And feed grounds have done a great job over time of separating wildlife and livestock during important times of the year when brucellosis can be transmitted. But now feed grounds create a problem for CWD, and so it's extremely complex. It involves the whole gamut of every kind of federal land management agency you can imagine, as well as private landowners and state land and game and fish land. And so that's been a big effort for the last few years for us. And then the other thing I'd say is the war on cheatgrass is something that I'm very passionate about. I think that, and I'm sure Jared can relate to this. He's seen this happen we both lived here forever. This state has changed the way it looks because of what I call cancer. The cancer of Wyoming is cheatgrass. And so I feel like the state is in a position now, we've got the right information, we can map that stuff, and we need to declare war on cheatgrass and invest resources into getting rid of it. And in fact, here recently at this budget session, we were able to secure $9 million to be used on private lands to do private land work for cheatgrass. The federal government, particularly at this point, the Forest Service has done a lot of work with cheatgrass. And so I think my hope is that a lot of folks come together to treat these invasive annual grasses across our state and try to make a difference with regards to the cancer of Wyoming.
Yeah, Brian, can you kind of go into, what's wrong with cheatgrass? Why are you raging a war on it?
Yeah, so I'll tell you that a lot of people ask me that question. They're like, well, there's some things that'll eat it. I think the first thing is that typically if it wasn't here before we got here and we brought it here, a lot of times it's not good. And cheatgrass is not a native species. It was brought in. It creates monocultures. It has a way of dominating anything that's disturbed and taking it over and creating just this monoculture of cheatgrass. A lot of critters don't like to eat it. Different stages of its development through the year, certain animals eat it. Certainly when it's coming up green before it has a head on it, livestock and wildlife will eat it. But at the end of the day, it's bad because it outcompetes everything else. The forage production that is so important to wildlife is reduced, and sometimes reduced significantly. Then the other thing is that cheatgrass really carries fire well. And, fire has been a tool, that we've been able to use for a long time. And I'm going to stop because it says I'm not connected. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah. We can still hear you.
So fire has been a really important tool in some habitat work, but fire that burns cheatgrass just encourages more cheatgrass, and it burns really hot. And it's cheatgrass carries fire, and it's not good. And I really feel bad for the folks in Nevada. They've had a heck of a time with fire and cheatgrass, and now they've lost millions of acres of habitat because of cheatgrass.
And Brian, what can landowners do if they realize they do have cheatgrass? What's kind of something from a private landowner's perspective that they can initiate in order to quell some of the problems?
Yeah, so I really encourage folks to get with their local resource district, conservation district, or NRCS office, because there was just a large push of resources to the state of Wyoming through their EQIP program to be able to secure funds to treat cheatgrass on private land. It's a great program, and there's a ton of opportunity there. Along with that, they do have some sideboards and some rules that are sometimes challenging for different ranches. With this new money that we secured this year through the legislature, when we stand that up, that'll be another opportunity that landowners will have to go seek additional funding to treat cheatgrass. And I keep saying cheatgrass. There's also in the northern part of the state, Medusa head and Ventonata that are also the same. They're the same kind of non-native invasive species that are really not good. And so that's the best first place for landowners to go is to the local, one of those three local entities. And Weed and Pest, I should have mentioned them as well. So Weed and Pest works on a lot of this too and has access to different resources to help landowners out.
Awesome. And Jared, I'd love to know from an outfitter's perspective, how do outfitters work with Wyoming Game and Fish? Kind of what's the connection there? Just for a lot of our guys who are hunters and trying to figure out how to enter that space.
Yeah. I talk a lot to our local biologists for like when they start having questions about, new tags that they're maybe talking about implementing, season dates, what we're kind of seeing, obviously biologists and Game and Fish in general. I mean, their wardens and the biologists are spread pretty thin. Wyoming's a big state and they got a lot of area to cover. So it's, I think it's real important for landowners and outfitters and guides that are spending a lot of time in a space to kind of update biologists on what you're seeing. Like sometimes if we start noticing a bighorn sheep die off, we might know about it faster than the Game and Fish because we're out there on a daily basis, or elk activity or different things like that. So I spend a lot of time and have a lot of discussions and try to go to as many public meetings as I can just to voice my concerns and my opinion on different things. And and that's not to go down a rabbit hole, but that's the interesting thing from the outside looking in, and the Game and Fish kind of no matter what they do, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's real hard to appease everyone at the same time. Like, in southeastern Wyoming, obviously we got a big game population, especially elk, is doing really, really well. And the Game and Fish is trying to harvest these numbers because there's certain ranches that are getting inundated with elk population, and there's other ranches that want to see more elk in that same area. So it's kind of a slippery slope no matter what direction they go, and a lot of management styles on and trying to appease everyone. So it's kind of interesting. But what's real interesting is just to see how fast areas change. When I've been in the outfitting business for about 22 years now, and east of I-25 on the Cottonwood Ranch that my dad and I managed for a long time. There was at one point we didn't even have landowner tags. And now it's an area of discussion because the elk numbers are so high, and it's hard to get that harvest because we talk about Wyoming's 50%, 48% of its public ground. A lot of the private ground exists in eastern Wyoming, and so the Game and Fish doesn't necessarily have all the tools at their disposal just to go in there and harvest all them elk, because these elk are within private land corridors that may not allow access. So I guess I can
Jared,
go on to this too.
That's a great.
You go for it, Brian.
Okay, so I was just going to say you really bring up a big issue, and like you said, mostly in eastern Wyoming, but we have it in other parts of the state as well, with just over elk populations that are over our management objectives, and they do have legitimate impacts on working lands, ranchers that are actually making a living off of their land through livestock production. And Jared outlined the challenge really, really well. There's these competing interests between landowners that have the same exact property right that we hold sacrosanct in Wyoming, but have a whole different vision about what they want on their ranch as far as an elk population. And whatever they decide has an effect on the neighbor who may be in a different situation. The opportunities to harvest cow elk has become so darned important to this challenge. And a lot of times, as you talked about interactions between the department and outfitters, we've had to have some really complex discussions with outfitters to say, hey, realize you're doing this as a commercial activity, but would you mind helping us out with harvesting the female portion of the segment after you've taken your guided hunters, primarily for bull elk? And a lot of outfitters have responded to that and helped us out, but it doesn't work if they don't have access to ranches that are going to let them do that. And so we've done some out of the box things and some things that are pretty uncomfortable for Game and Fish, but I have some optimism that we're going to be able to work through this challenge.
That brings up a good point, Brian. You talked about the importance of a private land early on and in the state, especially for management of invasives and endangered species. And now we're on to elk. And I don't think the general population really understands just how critical private ground is to big game animals. Like you kind of hit on it early that some of the best ground that was settled, it was settled for a reason, right? You had some water resource, you had some potential for some irrigation component, etc. So obviously it's very, very critical habitat. But everyone's like, oh, there's 50% of the state's public. Well, that's great. And so some big game utilize that public and obviously live on it, but there's a big part of that where they need private ground. You need private ground for connectivity, for migration corridors. It's probably some wintering ground. It's probably some rearing ground. Like, can you kind of speak to that on like how important private ground is for not only big game species, but I guess wildlife species in general, as far as the state's concerned?
Yeah, it's absolutely private land is critical, as you highlight. Basically, half of the state is private land, and the private land providing habitat, we wouldn't have anywhere near the diversity nor the abundance of wildlife that we enjoy in our state. It is hard to find a critter in our state that doesn't spend at least a portion of the year on private ground. One of the best examples that, a lot of folks come to Wyoming because they want to go to the First National Park and they want to go to Yellowstone. And most of those folks don't realize that all those bison and all those elk that they get to see in the summer while they're in Yellowstone National Park, a whole bunch of those critters spend a whole bunch of the winter on private ground, a long ways away from Yellowstone Park. I mean, they migrate huge distances to go clear from the southeast part of Yellowstone Park all the way to Meeteetse and spend their winter on private land. And that's kind of an extreme example, but that's replicated basically across the state. There are very, very few animals that spend their entire year-round life cycle only on public ground. Private is an absolutely critical piece of it. Couldn't have what we have without it.
And I think it shows just how important your department is. Animals don't stay in one place. There's a lot of pieces to the puzzle that allow these habitats to thrive and be what they are and be what animals need. And without kind of the glue that has these open dialogue, these conversations, listens to private landowners, outfitters, public lands, federal government, everything, without kind of this localized experts like you guys to really figure out what's important, none of this would really work. From like your educational standpoint to conversations with people like Jared, it's really neat, and it really shows the importance of having one department really oversee all of that, so everyone's voices are heard and everyone can kind of get all of the information that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things we pride ourselves in is trying to be that local contact with landowners. We've enjoyed good relationships with landowners for my entire career, and we pride ourselves in that. We typically have much more interaction with those local landowners in our local game warden biologist districts than really any other governmental agency for sure does. And we pride ourselves in that, and it's key to us being able to do what we have to do and what we're charged with doing by the statutes.
No, that's awesome. And it was really good just to meet you, Brian, and Jared, to hear kind of your opinion of how all of this is connected too. And I really appreciate you taking the time. If people want to learn more about your department and what you guys are doing and some of the projects, what are the resources available to the public and also landowners?
Yeah, so I would invite everybody to on April 10th, go on and check out our brand spanking new website that's been in the works now for 3 years, and go check it out. We're interested in feedback. It's a new launch. It's a new look. Haven't had a new one in a long time, but what we're hoping is that can be a one-stop shop for folks to go get what they need for wildlife management in Wyoming and game and fish department, all things game and fish. We certainly have, we have 8 regional offices and the Cheyenne headquarters located throughout the state. And those are resources for folks that live close to be able to go in and obtain information and publications. And then, I always encourage folks, especially landowners, to work with their local biologist and game warden because they can also connect them with the resources they need and the information they need.
Awesome. Well, this was I learned so much, and we kind of loved where our conversations led. We went totally off script, which is what I love most about these conversations. And I learned a lot. So thank you so much, Brian, for taking the time, and Jared for taking the time to meet with us today.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. And thank you to you all for joining us today for our Land Bulletin podcast. Thank you again to Brian Nesvik, Director of Wyoming Fish and Game, and Senior Vice President of Mirr Ranch Group, Jared Souza, for coming on the program today. For more information on the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and any of the programs we covered today, please visit wgfd.wyo.gov and give us your feedback. Give Brian's feedback on the new look April 10th. Also, to learn more about the ranch real estate or ranch marketing process, please be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on our website, www.mirranchgroup.com, or give us a call at 303-623-4545. Thanks so much. See you next time.